faculty at Antioch, Los Angeles. This week, we're having a special messy conversation on poetry as racial adjustment. And we've got 3 poets who will be reading some of their work and then have agreed to be in conversation with us about the role of poetry and the arts and racial justice issues. So should be a good conversation. We want to offer a special thanks to our poets, Mair Allen, Clarence Williams, and Nancy Lynée Woo for stepping in and helping us out. We had another messy conversation planned for this week, but sometimes the wheels fall off things. So we're really grateful to have these folks step in and help us out. As you see, the Messy Conversations is being recorded. If you, for whatever reason, desire to protect your privacy, you can turn off your camera, and you can also go into the settings and change how your name appears if you need to protect your name. So know that. And then our protocol is to ask you to remain muted. That helps sound quality until you're engaging in the conversation. And the best way, or our preferred way at least, for you to engage in the conversation is to put questions or comments or ideas, whatever it is, in the chat. And after our poets finish their readings and that part of our conversation, we'll be mining the chat for questions to keep the conversation going. So we'll call on you at that point. But we very much encourage you to take the time to put some questions in there. A lively conversation is what we're aiming for. So thank you for that in advance. And speaking of in advance, next week, November 15th, we'll have a messy conversation on race and technology with Sophia Noble, who's a recent MacArthur Fellow. And I'll be in conversation with her about her book, Algorithms of Oppression, which is a really interesting book. And we'll be looking at that intersection of race and technology and trying to unpack some of the issues that inform that discussion. So we encourage you to turn out for that. The week after that, we will not have a messy conversation because of the holiday that takes place that week. So we'll be taking a week off. So I think that's all the announcements I have, unless anybody on the planning team has one that I've forgotten. And I don't see anybody racing to unmute themselves. So we'll get started. Our first reader this evening is Mair Allen. I'm only going to give the briefest of introductions to each of them. Mair currently lives in Minneapolis, Minnesota. So that's why we're letting her go first, because she's visiting from out of state. It's been a long flight to get here, and so we just and she's an MFA candidate in the MFA in Creative Writing program here at Antioch, Los Angeles. So very glad to have you, Mair. Welcome.
Thanks, David. It's nice to see familiar faces and new faces. So I can start by saying one of my projects is kind of tracing how my family assimilated into whiteness. And so I'm going to read 2 poems from that, and then one that's more contemporary and dealing with more childhood and emotional aspects around that as well. So the first poem is Coffee. My great-grandmother tells me, Get the milk and pour it in the jug with blue flowers. I like my face best when reflected in the coffee urn, in the sugar, in your nose, and maybe around the eyes. The crows followed me from the hinterlands to this milk-drowned place. They took my eyes, but see, now you have them. He had my eyes, my son who rode a horse to war. Outside, sun echoes ice. Time cracks against the window pane. Our limbs pattern strange shapes on the yellow linoleum. They copy us with their shadows. Do not trust the shadow that speaks, but offer it coffee. Why did we come to this land to destroy it with milk, milk fields, milk frozen on the trees in glass bottles that break on the kitchen floor? This land we shaped with war between our teeth, war in the tender wheat of bread, in our children. My son rode a horse to war. My son rode a crow to war. They only asked for his eyes. Did this happen because you wrote it, or have they always been here, demanding? I tell them I'll make coffee, I say it, and their voices are a chorus. Now, now, now. They know what happens after. I have read my name is his name, even in death. In the newspaper, I am still a shadow of him, my husband who always took his coffee with milk and sugar. Fill the reservoir with water. I will show you how to make a man coffee. You came to make me feel better, but I am tired of feeling anything. Pour the coffee, call the crows. My son will teach me how to ride, but home. I want to go home. Turn on the oven, blow out the light. And this one, HXU. From the future mirrors are purposefully obscure reflections. When I picture them, one man wipes a dirty thumb across my nose, another's hips twist on similar warped spine, always a lid droops steadily over our twinned eyes. The air is choked with buzzing when they crest the low hill. The three of them, with dusty boots and blonde cropped hair, open their ears to the world. French hitches on the Easter winds, and they turn away. The trade is made. Letters cut from mouths, each heavy flopping hunk of tongue dried over the campfire. Tucked in tight hewn drawstring sachets, the first thing they bury is my name. I exhume the appellation, then discarded horseshoe, handful of musket balls, the desert fatigues, anvil of a rusted oven. I can hardly grasp or leverage. One man was offered the chance to trade story for land. That eager one man erased place from name. Only the grass whispers lush with the dead names of home, lands, mine, de aloe, 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 letters lost until the word becomes unmoored to Allen, of nowhere. I stand on the same low hill and the wind carries nothing. The blades hush to each other. The blades of grass hush and hush. The grass cuts my hands while I dig, and the blood reminds me what blood has forgotten. And then this last one, K-Swiss. Across the street from a bar with a neon green sign that glows through decades of smoke, home of the beautiful people. In the upper unit of a peach stucco duplex, there's a ghost of a know-it-all child. The child knows the numbers written between lines of red-stitched leather, the names of men that came asking fathers for favors. They remember how to get shook down and the father that taught them. Anyone asks for your shoes, give them up. You're too soft to hope for anything better than one less pair of shoes can buy new shoes, not new teeth. The child learned to apply this to many things: a new bike, clear pager, obviously, love, obviously. The family considered these things replaceable, bound to be taken or grown out of. The necessity of new summer shoes became a ceremony. The father would take last year's pair, not the laces' ends, and toss them, 2 worn moons orbiting towards the telephone line. In the heat of August, the child watched them bleach. Heavy, dead pigeons refusing to quit their wings, they balanced like the scale that weighs a feather against it all. The etching of numbers disappeared, then the red in the stitching, the family, and finally the shoes themselves, eaten by the sky. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much, Mair. Right off the bat, I recognize I owe you an apology. I didn't catch your pronouns until after you had started, so I apologize for that. Really beautiful, a kind of intimacy that resonates with something larger. I love it. Thank you. Our second reader is going to be Nancy Lynée Woo, who's a poet as well as a community organizer. Nancy says she's not feeling on top of her game today, but we're really, really glad to have her. That a lot of her work is about bringing the power of the arts to bring people together. She's also an MFA candidate here at the program at Antioch, Los Angeles. Welcome, Nancy.
Hi, thank you so much. Yeah, so I have a little bit of a frog in my throat, but I'm gonna get this thing done. It's gonna be good. So thank you so much for having me. That was a beautiful reading, Mair. And let's see, I just wanted to preface, I guess, with the note that I have written many, many, many poems about my mixed race identity, but there are times when this set is not necessarily on the nose about that, but I'm happy to talk about my family history at any, if it comes up, but everything that we write comes from our experiences, right? So this is Rain Balm Anti-Ode. Maybe I'm entitled to every suffering I desire. Who isn't facing a reckoning, thinking about reparation, lighting white candles in the bath on a full moon? I'm tempted to censor the way I talk about spirituality, the way I talk about the science of warming, the way ascension hurts, weaning off nicotine. My middle schooler writes, skateboarding is dope, then crosses out dope to say, very good. Meanwhile, I finally kicked the habit of using prison as a metaphor for angst. I know nothing of the panopticon's actual eye. I know about suburbs, wings, and fur, how to peer into the lagoon of the mind for signs. I can Google anything: magic, neglect, metamorphic rock. I could write a mean essay about what it feels like to be trapped by an overwhelming amount of freedom, licking the mother wound in between staring down a bighorn sheep on a cliffside, headed for the bridge to nowhere, doing lion's breath until purple carrots spring from the belly of the riverbed, steward of extravagant student loans. The energy of my crown, I'll say it, vibrates as I find abundance in a soul full of geese, a leaf, flabbergasting myself with the pleasure of wind chimes. The looking glass celebrates as often as it mourns. Blue-footed booby, black rhino, Javan tiger. I still only know how to change one thing at a time. Sitting outside, rocking, imagine sending tendrils down to the molten core of the planet like an anchor. I'm tempted to censor myself anytime I write light, but screw it, I'm in training to resist the old myths of the bishops. I have a good relationship with my third eye. It's really dope. Some mornings, I wait outside for dawn to strike, doing nothing but feeling radical while the terrier from the shelter works on a bone. We trot around together, sniffing and looking, singing little songs. I'm happy, he says to me all the time. Thank you, I say back, and marvel at a few well-kept lilies bouncing out from a brick wall. I make a note of hope wherever it sprouts, watching another rain bomb drench Arizona in a matter of seconds. When it is red, the coil glowing on the stove warns you not to touch it. Oven at 400, dancing around the kitchen, I sometimes worship apocalyptic woes. Cockroaches, tin roof rain, end of days, myths of scrounging for sugar, hiding friends under fake floors, preparing for the worst. I pull back the covers to see what's feeding on our sleep. Sweating on the armpits of the apron, I can't claim to know one end of the book from the other. History and ignition chamber, I can't always count on. So I'm waving a wand of yellow roses to build up bulletproof heaven, dreams of dill seed sprouting here in the afterlife of heroes where women lead the pack. True or false? I fired a shotgun once. It backfired before the power went out in the country. All 13 stripes trumpeting great whiteness. Imagine being buried alive with a TV and a smartwatch. Flushed cheeks. I'd rather be caught scheming, crawling toward the interior. A belief is a delicate bloom. That lava exists is a fact I'm willing to accept. Therefore, strawberries, lip gloss, hot peppers, and panic buttons. You learn to identify poison. You punch out of the box. Okay, let's see, maybe one more. This one's, yeah, let's see how long this takes. Let your body be a container. Shake it how you are not supposed to shake a 2-liter bottle of soda. And then open it wide, spread across a mat or a dance floor, starfish in the bed. Stretch as if no one's there with you. Check. Is anyone there with you? In bed? A small plane? These wide, wide streets? How big are you? How spacious? What shape? Where are you in space? Touch the edges of your body to another edge. How solid? Let your mind go like a paper lantern drifting. Where do you end? What do stars taste like? Will you share? What ripples are you creating with your body of language? Where did you bury the glow at the tail end of rain? Perhaps your body is a container for fireflies with the lid half off, leaving a trail of stars. And how do you live? with all that? Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Nancy. A lot going on in those poems, ironic interrogations and absurdity and engagement with philosophical and political issues. Really rich. Thank you so much. I want to remind folks that if you have questions that you'd like to ask to any of our poets and conversationalists for today, please put them in the chat. I see lots of love for our two readers so far in the chat. I'm going to do my best to also make my way through all the comments and find the questions and bring them to you shortly. Our third reader, well known to every attendee of Messy Conversations, is our own Clarence Williams, a graduate of the undergraduate program at Antioch, Los Angeles, and currently a graduate student in the urban sustainability program. Very engaged in the arts in many aspects. And I saw from his bio that he's got contributions to both volume 6 and volume 7 of Snapshots, which is published by the Community Writers of Los Angeles. So welcome, Clarence. You're on mute, Clarence.
I do that every time. Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring. Ring with the harmonies of liberty. A poem is a song, and a song is a poem. Reparations. For the hundreds of thousands who died while crossing the Middle Passage. Reparations. For the unknown ones raped and maimed, but still made it through. Reparations. For the thousands left hanging in a tree, like strange fruit in the darkness of night. Reparations. For the surviving inhumane treatment and forced medical experimentation. Reparations. For the untold numbers of Black folk clubbed down while peacefully protesting and demonstrating. Reparations. For the pregnant mothers who bore the force of brutal water hoses. Reparations. For the children who never got to see mommy or daddy. Reparations. For the countless numbers of Black men fighting in every war for America, coming home to be devalued, disrespected, and dishonored. Reparations. For the redlined Black neighborhoods transformed into ghettos for greed. Reparations. For the Fanny Lou Hamers who only wanted to vote. Reparations. For the little children bombed in their homes and their churches. Reparations. For the denial of education, first-class citizenship, fair housing, lack of jobs, medical care, and wealth. Reparations. For the ancestors who were stolen, losing everything a human could possibly possess. Reparations, reparations, restitution. We who believe in freedom cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. A poem is a song, and a song is a poem. I could not march. I could not march for protests for Black Lives Matter. I could not carry another banner. I've carried the banners for women's rights, LGBTQ rights, for environmental rights, immigration reform, joined the picket lines for labor unions, anti-apartheid, and yes, marched with wonder for King Holiday. I could not march. I could not march to another vigil saying the names of the murdered ones. There are simply too many. I could not march in solidarity with my brothers and sisters physically, not because of any mobility issue, but because of my mind. My mind is clouded with the smoldering vision of Red Summer, the violence of Bloody Sunday and every day of the week, the burnings of Rosewood, Greenwood, Wilmington, the lynchings in Elaine, reaching past every hanging tree in Mississippi's Delta, dogs being sicked on little children, water hoses forced on the bellies of pregnant women, houses of worship bombed, and the killings of Kent State. And the assassinations of Martin, Medgar, Robert, and John, and every Black Panther. I could not march. I could not march because it all started in 1619 by white men who recognized the strength, abilities, and power of Black people. It will now take the descendants of those white men to fix the residual ills that continue to assault Black people, keeping my family marching to Zion. So I must surrender to the understanding of anti-racism versus anti-Blackness. I must do the work for my healing, a cleansing of DNA, suppressing the hope, hoping that things will change. I could not march. I could not march with self-proclaimed allies. Allies, will you tell Karen, George, and Becky to call the police? Call for police defunding, call for community policing. There will always be driving while Black, shopping while Black, jogging while Black, and bird watching while Black. And yes, barbecues and loud music, Skittles, and iced tea. Allies, will you stand after the photo ops and Twitter feeds die? Will you stand in the truth of justice and righteousness? Or will you simply return yourself under the rock of broken promises and complacency? Will you, in this right now moment, stand with me in taking power to policy? Or will you just morph into the abyss of silence? I could not march. I could not march singing another protest song. I couldn't sing a freedom song, no overcoming song. I could only sing a declaring mantra from pianissimo to crescendo in the rhythm of my spirit, dancing to the cadence of my soul. I could not march. I could not march. I could not march. A poem is a song, and a song is a poem. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Clarence. Such powerful work, and the first poem in particular on reparations reminds me somewhat of Roque Dalton, the great Salvadorian poet, and his poem, A Love Poem. So I recommend that to folks if you're interested in those things. I'm not finding questions unless I'm overlooking them in the chat. So if anybody on the planning team sees questions that I'm missing, let me know. Otherwise, I'll look for hands of people that would like to be in conversation with any or all of our three poets.
David, do you mind if I say something about my work and why I wrote those pieces? I just want to share that I generally write poetry from an emotional place. I started out writing poetry when I wanted to honor my grief when family members passed. And over the last decade, I would say, there have been so many things happening in our world, you know, like the border situation, immigration, and Black Lives Matter, the George Floyd situation. So those emotional moments fueled me to respond in poetry. I started out my piece by singing Lift Every Voice and Sing, because it was actually written as a poem in 1900 by James Weldon Johnson, whose brother then put it to music, and it was performed by 500 students in tribute to Lincoln. And it later was adopted as a Black national anthem. So that's why I open with that to illustrate that many times poetry becomes a torch for our social justice and our humanness. And then later it becomes a song, and hopefully it becomes a dance, a movie, or some other artistic expression, a painting or whatever. And I too am inspired by the Harlem Renaissance, where W.E. Du Bois was trying to get the writers of the time and the poets to really kind of emphasize what was happening to Black people. But many artists, like many of us are, we want to just create our art and not be pulled in to be used for some kind of political agenda. And that was what happened with the artists in the Harlem Renaissance. So I just wanted to share that.
Thank you, Clarence. And I wonder with our other poets, Mair and Nancy, you know, Clarence, I hear you saying that the inspiration, motivation is kind of an encounter with history, with a moment in history. And I wonder for Mair and Nancy, for the poems that you read or the poems that define your larger work, where you find your inspiration and motivation.
I can jump in on that with something I was thinking about as to motivation. I think a lot about the role, the intersection between poetry and the arts and actual social justice advocacy and activism in the world. And, you know, I come from a long, I think, I feel like I've heard a lot of traditions of poets basically saying, like, you know, poets stay in your lane, like poetry is beautiful, it's an art, but poetry can't save the world. All right, poetry is not going to save the world. Okay. And I've always been a little bit of a, you know, community organizer and you know, activist. And I really wanted to share a quote from Why Poetry by Matthew Zapruder, which I just read. I don't know if anyone read this book, but he takes the stance that actually, yeah, okay, poetry probably can't save the world, but you know what? The world probably needs saving from all corners. So why not have poetry pull its weight? And the role of poetry is to open us up to possibility, to imagination, to depth of feeling. Like Mary Oliver says, poetry can be a mystical document, a bridge between worlds. But I mean, there's this one quote he says, you know, poems, however, let's be real, poems are an undependable vehicle for advocacy. The poem is easily distracted. So like, let's be real, a poem probably can't save the world, but a poem might open up a new way of thinking, a perspective, a feeling. And then he says, and I agree, you know, when you're done writing your poem, go sign a petition, go march, go do something in the streets. So I just wanted to bring that out, I guess.
I can definitely follow and echo in some ways from this book that I just got, Organizing for Autonomy. And the quote isn't about poetry, but it says, social revolution is not just seizing power or tearing down the system. It is a passage between worlds. And I often think of poetry as a passage between worlds, the internal world, the external world, possibilities of different worlds. And one of the things that this conversation is this idea of activism and Nancy, self-care, right? We were talking about that. And I think that like in disability justice theory, those things are completely entwined, right? Like we can't go out and march, right? If we aren't in a space within ourselves to do that, and have nourished ourselves in a way, it's not sustainable, right? And so I think that is another possibility in that, right? It's not one or the other. And people are always trying to set up, it's this or that, it's this or that. And like, right, we need all of those things together.
Thank you very much. We have a question. We have a question from Kelly Hauer about teaching. Kelly, would you like to ask your question?
I was really excited about the passage in the poem where the kid crossed out skateboarding is dope and wrote skateboarding is very nice. And I think about the stultification that can happen for students. And I wondered if you could talk as a teacher, Nancy, about what parts of the domains of poetry or activism or both come together in your experience as a teacher.
Hi, Kelly. Thank you for the question. Yes, as a fellow teacher, what a great question. I love your use of the word stultification. That is a great word to use about certain things within the public school system. Let's see, that moment came about when I was teaching over the summer at a middle school here in Long Beach. And these were some really wonderful kids, really great middle schoolers that I was so pleased to work with them. I showed up as my full self. I was my, expressive artist self in this school that literally had bars, like it was an enclosed, school with bars on it. It locked like a prison. And so I felt both humbled and honored to be able to, just try and show up as myself. The very first day I brought my stickers and my stamps and my, my fun stuff for art for these middle schoolers. They trudge in. It's not a very welcoming environment, this particular school. And so my job, I felt, was to provide a little bit of welcoming. And we had music and we were dancing and trying to get some play and some freedom in the classroom. And one of the really cool things we got to do was a community circle. So what we would do is get the kids together. I would have a talking stick and we would pass it around. We would talk about really surprisingly deep issues. They went there with me. We talked about race. This was a school of all Black and brown kids. There's not one single white kid in the school. And we talked about race. We talked about suicide. We talked about drugs. We talked about prison. And I don't know exactly what allowed that space, other than I think coming to it just from my own subjective perspective as an artist. I'm willing to talk about anything with anyone, basically anywhere, because I think part of the role of art is to listen, as so many of you here are graciously doing, and as we do with each other. I think a big part of being an artist and being a bridge in the world, even with middle schoolers, even with 7th graders, it can happen anywhere in the world. To be open, to be vulnerable, and to listen to each other.
Thank you. I've got a question for all of you. I have a few, but I'll just give you one. For each of you, you showed up and agreed to come because you see a connection between your work as an artist, as a poet, and social justice issues and social change. And so I'd like to explore that a little bit with you. I'm sure you're all aware that there's a danger in that, right? That to your art, that your art could become pedantic, right? Your art could be trying to tell people how to, and we've all read poems and experienced other pieces of art that are exactly that way. And so I wonder, as you wrestle with your work and dancing that line back and forth between making a contribution around social justice issues, but also art, how do you negotiate that so that you don't end up on the pedantic side of things, but that you have a lively art practice?
Well, I'll go first. It's never been a consideration for me, because, you know, I am pretty much a child, I would say, from the 60s. So I've had so many heroic role models, both from an activism and leadership standpoint, and also from a cultural entertainment artist standpoint. So when I look at people, I don't know how many of you may have seen the Nina Simone documentary, the narrative documentary that was produced a few years ago, and it was called What Happened, Miss Simone. But Nina Simone was one of those people I did not understand until like in this last decade, that she fought so hard through her art, through her music, to make a difference in the civil rights movement. And she didn't understand why other artists weren't following suit. And to your point, David, it's probably why they were afraid that it would affect how they were received, you know, what the messages would be, you know, would be implied upon their existence and the harm it might bring. So, but the daring stab that she took on the civil rights movement was mirrored by others, because as I kept using my own theme, you know, a poem is a song and a song is a poem, there were so many people who were artists that actually did do that. They did take the poetry, the song, and talk about the times and what was wrong with society, what's happening in America, what's happening in the globe, you know, and they expressed it through that medium. But for me, I think that, you know, unlike the Harlem Renaissance, I think we bear a responsibility at whatever art form we are, that we take the risks, that we are responsible, that we do show up and be that witness to the truth. You know, we must bear witness, we must speak truth, we must demonstrate truth through our art. I don't know if anyone's seeing what Bill T. Jones is doing in New York right now with dance, but it's exciting. I mean, we know his work back in the 80s with the AIDS, you know, pandemic, but now he's doing stuff around, you know, COVID-19 and what's happening with our country now. And it's exciting stuff. And we know that spoken word poets, which I'm more of a spoken word poet, you know, there's no holding back. You know, you just take the risk.
I suppose I can jump in on that. Thinking about taking risks. I like taking risks a lot in my work. I like to experiment a lot with form and voice and style. But for myself, I know that it doesn't always work. But I think the risks are they're certainly worth taking, because that's how we push our boundaries of knowledge. That's how we push toward what we don't know. So I would agree that we need to take risks. I would also like to add that I think what keeps poems from being political poems, at least from being pedantic, is a focus on the music. So as Clarence was literally using music, and I will quote from the book I just currently have in my hand again. You know, the critter says, and the best, he says, oh, I lost it, I'm so sorry. See, I'm like a little bit foggy, but that's okay. He says, the best poems, often the poet does not know the answers. And I think that's another way of keeping it from becoming sort of diatribic is, pushing against what we don't know, asking questions, rather than trying to distill like an obvious truth, I guess, is kind of where I'm going. I'm also reading this great book by Stephen Dunn, a memoir on poetry called Walking Light. And he talks about poetry as being sort of analogous to gambling, that we need to take risks, and sometimes they don't always work. And just to the idea of craft, that's how I go about it. Is I write a lot. I'm a fast writer. I'm a prolific writer. I write all the time, take a lot of risks. Some of those might work out sometimes, but if we don't let our minds unravel on the page with what we truly feel, truly think, even if it's not pretty, even if it's not coherent, even if it's a little messy, I'm a very messy writer, but somehow, some way I can find some gems within that. Hopefully it's musical, hopefully it's truthful. And those are the ones that I let sort of bubble to the surface.
Nancy, I really appreciate the quotation and the larger sentiment that sometimes poems don't have answers. I know in my classes, I try to tell my students that I hope they finish the course with more questions than answers. If we did that, then we did okay. And Mair, did you want in on this?
Yeah, definitely. I think that, yeah, for me, for writing, especially poems of family and historical reclamation, those aren't the majority of the poems that I write. Those are the poems I have to sit with in a different way. And I think that part of, right, like that question, Nancy, it's not, I don't have an answer. I don't have an answer for how these things happened. I'm trying to draw an outline of a picture. And I think to keep from being pedantic in those spaces, what I found is I have to bring myself into them. I have to have a lyrical speaker there. I have to ground them in that. And I find that those texts are often more surreal and open up a different kind of space in that way. I often think of Fanny Howe, who her prose work is incisive and her poetry is fairies and like syntax structure that doesn't make sense. And she writes about bewilderment. And so I think thinking for people of European heritage who have been subsumed into whiteness, part of that is like is refusing emotion, is refusing bewilderment, is always being correct and being really afraid and full of shame to be wrong. And there's a huge amount of punishment that can take place socially. And so I think that the ability to let go a little bit in a poetic space is something that can be political if you can open yourself to those things.
Yeah, thank you. I see Kelly's got another question. Kelly, you want to bring that in?
Sure. I wanted to ask Clarence, you're in urban sustainability, and I was talking to a friend a while back who was talking about some practitioners in urban sustainability looking at ways to design without spikes and bars and barriers that keep people from sitting down or entering into places. And I wonder if you see an analogy to some of the formalism in poetry and literature and ways in which the marriage of song and poetry can sort of open that up a bit and bring in new forms.
Well, it's an exciting thing to be a student at Antioch in urban sustainability for all those images, all those reasons. And when you think about the things that go on in a physical society, that is the planning of a city, the environment of a rural community, you know, those structures you talk about in the urban community, it's a real thing. And so therefore, it's about humanism, it's about harmony or the lack thereof. So it certainly begs itself to not only poetry and song, but so many other artistic expressions, which I always enjoy doing. We have some great professors at Antioch, and many times they may ask the class, you know, to do a group poem based on, you know, the very situation. And it can be very fun. And for me, you know, it's exhilarating. I love it. And then sometimes we actually are given, you know, the actual assignment to writing a poem. So then that becomes a task around that. But, you know, it reimagining how our world, you know, I can't say our America, but our world is being restructured and reimagined at this point. Those kind of environments and those kind of physical challenges on how moving forward as a society, it certainly begs for us as artists to express the reality, you know, of those situations. So yeah, that's a nice reminder. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I right now I'm chin deep in the work of Donna Haraway, and she talks about the relationship between arts and activism as a practice of worlding, of you know, making world with other critters, not just with oneself. And I think about that in around this question that's on the table right now about the role of poetry with politics. And it seems to me that it's not to bring a totalized truth to the table, not to give voice to a totalized truth, but to participate in worlding, in making the world. And truth would, you know, truth is a way of killing the world, I think, in many ways, because it's always false, it's always partial, and so it's in a stance of pretend more often than not. I see that Lisa Lepore, our librarian and a member of the planning team, has a question. Lisa.
Thanks. Thank you, David. I was just curious kind of who you write for, where you imagine your poems landing when you write them, and if that affects how you write them and how they end up kind of looking like and sounding like and all of that. I suppose who your audience is and how that affects the writing process.
Okay, I can jump in since I guess I think about this a lot. I mean, on the first draft, on the words just coming through, I'm writing for myself. I think a lot of people kind of might relate to that, but you know, I think at the end of the day, I do imagine when I go back in for, you know, which poems are going to make it to the next stage, because I've actually calculated it before. Like there are times when I write a poem a day, every single day, and 1 out of 10 might be a keeper, you know, so just to give you an idea of my stats. And so, you know, which poems are going to make it to publication, which ones are going to make it to the world. I actually go through a pretty intense sifting process of my own emotional temperature, my own viewpoint, my own lens. It's actually in that sifting process that I get to sit with myself and be like, all right, Nancy, what do you really think? Like, what voice is coming through? Is this the voice of your father? Is this the voice of your teachers? Is this the voice of your, you know, your best friend? Like, is this voice that you're writing from a supportive voice of what you actually believe and who you are and your values? Or is this a voice of criticism, of dismay, of whatever oppressive force, you know, fill in the blank that might be influencing me? And so I had to sift through. And so I feel like I find the voice of clarity, the voice of, since we're talking about truth, maybe not the voice of truth, but there is no one truth, but the voice of my own perspective. and like the truest perspective I can really get to that I feel is worth sharing with the world. And when I get to that place, and I want to be an advocate for animals, for the planet, for all peoples, you know, for plants, for all of that good stuff. If I feel like I'm an advocate for lack of a better word, the good in the world, that's when I want to literally shout it to anyone. Put it anywhere, put it out into the spaces, put it on the internet, you know, speak it into Zoom, speak it from a street corner, you know, put it on my blog, put it on my Facebook, like, and then last thing I'll say is that I do often feel like I am imagining my reader as someone similar to myself. I can't help it, but someone who cares about things in the same way that I do, and who might want a sense of camaraderie that other people care about these things too.
For me, I've never thought about who I was writing for, because as I shared earlier, for me, I'm led to write poetry, especially from an emotional standpoint. And then the other thought is from a consciousness that I would like to think is divinely appointed. When you just start to write sometimes for yourself, and it's often, you know, always for yourself, at least in my situation. I don't think about an audience, because I don't think I'm writing to share it with the world. And if I'm brave enough to share it with someone, then I start in my editing process to think about who might become the audience. And that's only at a point that someone says, oh, you should share that. Oh, you know, why don't you submit that? Or, you know, and I just got published. My poetry just got published last year for the first time. I mean, I've been a publicist, a working publicist, but I never considered any of that stuff to be like, you know, credible writing. It's just, to me, it was technical writing, you know, writing, you know, for studios and for newspapers and radio stations. That, to me, that was not like real creative work. It was just technical work. So I never think about my poetry as being something for the world, but now I'm finding out that it does have a place. And so I'm getting, as Maya Angelou would say, I'm getting a little more courage to put it out there. And speaking of Maya, you know, often you guys, some of you've heard one of the I Could Not March piece I did today, but I often will open up with a song, because I worked for James Baldwin for nearly 3 years, and through him I met Maya Angelou. So when he died, we became closer. And every time I saw her perform publicly, she always opened up with a song. And that's why I did that, because, you know, you want to connect to the audience physically on every rim that you possibly can. So that's me.
Mine isn't very, I write for my love. I write for one person all the time. I don't imagine anyone else reading it. So that's for better or worse.
Sweet. I'm reminded, as Clarence was talking, Plato identifies a couple of different kinds of divine madness, and poetry is one of them. That it's an example of divine madness, that we transcend the rational, and the muses speak to us, and we get into the messy realm of metaphor, which is a great place to play. I really want to, it's about 5 o'clock. I want to thank all of our poets and everyone who joined us today in the virtual audience for being here. We close up formally at 5, but we hang out if you feel like hanging out for another 15, 20 minutes and continue the conversation. Remember that next week we'll have Sophia Noble with us talking about technology and race. Her book is just extraordinary, Algorithms of Oppression. If you're at all interested in things like social media and search technologies and how that all plays out with issues of race. We very much encourage you to be back and listen to this recent MacArthur Fellow speak to us on these issues. We're really fortunate to have her. As always, drive home safely from wherever you are. And if you want to hang out, we're here for another 15 or 20 minutes. And as a way of transition, and it's kind of a follow-up in some ways to Lisa's question, I want to ask the poets, or anyone, frankly, who understands your poetry better, you or your audience?
I think better is kind of loaded differently, right? I imagine that people understand my poetry differently than I understand it. But that's kind of the idea of that passage or that bridge, you know, and where you can meet and create those connections. I do think it's a conversation, whether that's someone, like Lisa said, like maybe by themselves reading it. There's still going to be thoughts that are coming up. There's still going to be a process there. And so I think that it's so connected to each person. I don't want to say better, but I do think that it's a translation, right? Even if you're using the same language, everything, it's all a translation.
Yeah, I think it's like looking at a painting. Everyone sees something different beyond what the artist may have intended. And then the more you turn away and look at it again, you see new things and, new awakening moments. So though I may write for myself, and I may feel like I know the meaning of it, other people who, engage in the work will see something different. And that's good, because then it awakens my consciousness even deeper.
Basically ditto. I love when people will see things in my work that I didn't recognize. Or one of my favorite things is people giving me adjectives about my work. They'll when they describe my work, and I'll be like, wow, I would never have known to describe my own work that way. So I find it thrilling to have anyone read my work ever, I guess, in general.
Other folks who want to engage in conversation with our poets? I offered better, by the way, as to give you something to push off against. Partly, but I also wonder sometimes. I'm always surprised when someone offers me an understanding of my work, and sometimes it's just a different understanding, and I'm appreciative, and it does put us in conversation, and that's one of my fundamental things, right? I always want to be in conversation with everyone about everything. But other times it actually seems to me to be a better understanding of my work. So I had both motivations when I asked the question. But others who want in on the conversation?
I'm just so curious about your personalities, not knowing all of you very well, but being excited to share the activism spirit and this work that we're doing. I'm wondering how you feel your personality conveys your messages or your experience through poetry, and does that change as you grow older?
Well, it definitely changes.
If you do, you might not. I mean,
because I'm the oldest person on the panel, so it definitely changes as you get older, because you begin to, like, as they say, from a cliche, you don't sweat the small stuff anymore. So most of my life, I've never self-identified as being a writer, a poet, and certainly not an activist, even though I wrote about marching with Stevie Wonder in the cold days of Washington, D.C., trying to get a King holiday, or working with the Congressional Black Caucus, writing political speeches for them. You know, I would never assign myself as being an advocate for anybody. You know, I certainly would not have considered myself to be a poet while I worked around, you know, James Baldwin, or had the friendship of Maya Angelou and hang around Toni Morrison and Rosa Guy and all the great writers of their generation. You know, I would just sit at their feet and just wonder in awe. But, you know, my own self-identity has really progressed to now. I mean, there's an awakening when you actually reach a certain time mark in your life where you just have to live your truth. You know, it's not about anything else. If you want to advocate for something or speak up and use your voice on behalf of your family, friends, community, you know, city, country, you know, then you just take it, you know, and you don't worry about what people consider you to be. You know, I think it's risky because you become something of an enigma. I think oftentimes professionally people try to put me in a box and figure out what he does. Oh, he's a publicist. Oh, he's a producer. Oh, he does. No, I just am. So that's kind of the way I feel about it.
Thank you, Clarence.
So am I understanding the question to be about how personality interacts with poetry? Because if so, I mean, I've always felt like I've had perhaps an overabundance of personality. And at the beginning of my poetry career, I felt like I had to kind of stuff myself down to fit into the coffee shop box, you know. But at this point, you know, kind of like in my poem about, you know, you're using your own language, using your own vernacular, like, I don't know, at this point, I'm trying to be more brave and just showing up as who I am in my own personality. I'm, you know, very expressive. I like to work humor into my poems. Like you know, like all of us, we have a very rich tapestry of experiences that make us who we are. And yeah, kind of jumping off what Clarence said, like, I don't know, I'm trying to just be braver and put myself on the page and let my voice, my actual voice, come through, and not the manufactured voice that maybe in the beginning, as you know, many years when I first started writing, I tried, you know, we emulate other people's voices. But I think after a long time, I'm like, all right, here's my voice, here I am.
I just want to quickly jump in before, excuse me, Mair, but Nancy, when you were talking about just failing, just writing and then writing and failing and being willing to do that, it's so important, and it's so hard to do, to let ourselves fail.
And Kirsten, you mentioned Audre Lorde, the great Audre Lorde. You want to expand on poetry is not a luxury?
Yes, that was one of her statements, and her position that poetry is anything but a luxury. It was not. Poetry is essential, and in terms of the second wave of the women's movement, it's not exactly an exaggeration to say that it was born out of poetry, women's poetry. Women were writing poetry in the late 60s and 70s, and it was through poetry that the women's movement found its voice, you could say. And in that way, it seems as though poetry can or did certainly change the world in that aspect. It changed how people thought about, how women thought about ourselves. And two of the most important figures in the public figures, people who we read in educational foundations, both Adrienne Rich and Audre Lorde, were first of all poets. And, and out of their poetry came the kinds of insights that we are still talking about today. And that's just a perspective from the history of the women's movement that seems relevant to what we're talking about here. I guess I could add, that I don't know, maybe I shouldn't say this.
Oh, you should.
Have courage.
Audrey, so I was the editor of Chrysalis magazine, and Audrey was our poetry editor, and she was trying to convince me that we needed more pages for poetry. And she said, Kirsten, poems are not luxuries. I said, okay, I think you should write a column about that.
Good to have you back, Kirsten.
She wasn't too happy with me about my allotment. So now I'm doing penance to Audrey
All
by
these-
bringing her up.
And Lisa, you mentioned Muriel Ruckeiser with the similar sentiment.
Yeah. And yeah, I love that quote. I'm sorry, Mair, I think I cut you off earlier. I think you were going to.
Oh, I don't mind. Because what a great story, you know. And I think that I think sometimes it's easy to take for granted the moments or conversations that we have with other artists or other thinkers in our lives that we're like, I don't want to say spoiled, but fortunate to have, and you don't realize the changes those small moments make, or that they can be historical markers or things like that. The question about personality coming through in our work or our activism, I think that I would say my personality is hyper compartmentalized. And I would say that that comes through in my work, in my poetry, and in my activism by how separate they are, but how I couldn't, and I don't think of myself as an activist, but like just any more than existing in the world and building my own awareness to it would be impossible if I didn't have a space to process it. And I find that that's what poetry gives me, is a place to work through questions, otherwise unsayable things or even unthinkable things. So
Thank you, Mair.
I just want to say quickly, I know that Clarence has so many stories, and Kirsten, your story, and I think there are just all these little stories out there, these threads that have brought all together, would be so extraordinary. So it's not, I mean, and I guess they're lost to us, but to what Mair's saying too, that there are those moments that are precious that we might in the moment not realize it, but later reflect upon them, their worth.
The Harlem Renaissance also had such an abundance of poets and poetry. When I've looked closely at that movement, I was surprised at what a wide range of poets were active. And I often wondered if it wasn't something similar to what I described about the women's movement, that the Black poets were finding their voice, finding their rage, finding their beliefs, their love, their passions, and giving voice to that in a poem. You don't have to write a whole novel. You can write a few stanzas and say so much. And that's how that was a thought that came to me. But you would be the one to know about that, Elaine. You know that movement so well.
Yeah, I was thinking that earlier, listening to really all three of the poets, and in particular, the Renaissance period was so powerful that it inspired the Black arts movement. And Audre Lorde spoke of the Black arts movement and its impact. And until this day, Nikki Giovanni and Sonia Sanchez, they're still around, and they were inspired and continue this inspiration that we hear today. And we see so much of that on college campuses and in public spaces where people are coming together. So, absolutely, poetry can be powerful and empowering. Absolutely.
Yeah, it's poetry is like a space to challenge language. And if you are in a position because of your body to be thrown outside of capitalism and to be used by capitalism and to be unvalued, to have your labor devalued, and English is a language of commerce and capitalism, if you are going to push against that conception of yourself as a Black person, as a woman, as a gay person, as anyone who can't reproduce or produce in these systems of capitalism, you have to break the language.
Mm-hmm.
And poetry is the space to do that. And I think that's just another aspect of how it can shift things. Telling stories.
Radical adjustment.
Yeah, really beautifully put, Mair. And it makes me think in a complimentary way about so many of the women poets that Kirsten was talking about in the second wave. And that one of the arguments that they made was, when all you've got is a kitchen table. And in fact, This Bridge Called Our Back was published by Kitchen Table Press, that picked up on that metaphor. And just, when all you've got is a kitchen table. So you don't have a room of your own, right? You don't have, that luxury of uninterrupted time. Then poetry also, as a form, challenges language and politics in interesting ways. Anyone? Go ahead, Clarence, please.
No, I was just going to say, and to your point, and what resonates with me with what Kirsten just shared with us on the women's movement. I was having a chat with Lisa last evening, and I brought up, Zora Neale Hurston, who was very much a part of the Harlem Renaissance, and how I was an adult, in my first, couple years of undergrad, did I even know who Zora Neale Hurston was? It was not in my English book, at all. But to think that, she, maybe for her, poetry was a luxury. I don't know, because she was, having to write for an audience in a sense. That was how she could live, by having these sponsors who would let her go to Florida and write folklore and tell stories and tales. But then she would turn around and write a poem about sleeping in Sorrow's kitchen and licking out all the pots, which is something that she wasn't really grappling for an audience per se, but she was expressing her truth. So I just kind of thought about that, and the fact that there were so many writers of that time, of that movement, that were women, and many times not given credit for their body of work.
Right.
And it's years later before you ever learn about them. I mean, even when I took one of Dr. Gills's class, on Harlem Renaissance, for instance, there were women that when I did research, I said, oh my God, they had 3 novels before all of this, and no one ever talks about it, and they were already editors of key journals and, et cetera, et cetera. But, that's why we must fight for everyone to be at the table.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm actually reading a book right now about women environmentalists. It's just an anthology of some of the major voices of women environmentalists from, starting in the late 1800s that I never heard about in schools. It was always always the men. I mean, we all know the story, but the women of the Beat generation, I remember, you know, because I'm listening to all your stories in awe of a time and a place that I wasn't, you know, around for. So I, you know, read this book, Women in the Beat Generation, because my first exposure to poetry was through the Beats. Like, how cool were they? You know, they're super on the streets, like anti-capitalism, like just very anti, you know, bohemian, all that. And I didn't know there were any women even at all in that movement until somebody had to go out and find them and put them in an anthology, which I'm so very grateful they did. Same thing now I'm learning about, you know, women environmentalists. So I think it's something I think about as a woman a lot, that only a couple of generations ago, you know, we could even open our own bank account without our having a freaking husband or father sponsoring us. You know, it's just, so when we think about time and when it comes to obviously civil rights issues and women's rights issues, you know, LGBT rights issues, like sometimes time seems so incredible how fast things have happened, how short within such, you know, a time span of generations, things have changed. And I don't know, I grew up thinking, you know, being taught like everything's good, right? I grew up in a time and a space when it was like, that's history. Civil rights is history. Women's rights is history. And like, no, it's still obviously relevant.
I'm conscious of the time. This has been such a delight. We've had such a great run this quarter with Messy Conversations, just really wonderful conversations each week, which, you know, sometimes maybe get a little heady. And so this is a great oasis in the middle of our quarter of the arts. And can't thank you enough, Clarence and Mair and Nancy, for on very short notice coming in and doing way more than bailing us out, giving us a little strength for the journey, as they say in some traditions.
Mhm.
So I encourage everybody to unmute yourselves and show some love to our guests.
Yay!
Thank you so much.
Thank you very
Terrific,
much.
terrific session. Thank you all. Thank you all. I
Thank you.
really enjoyed it.
Thank you for standing in your space and reading the word.
I wish I could just sit with you guys for a while and talk about all the stuff I don't know. It's odd to talk about myself, you know. I'm like, now I want all your stories.
Well, come back next week, you guys. Come to Messy Conversations. It's nice having
Yes.
MFA here.
Yeah.
We'll give you a half-price ticket now that you've participated.
Well, speaking of which, I have to hop off and join my department in their happy hour discussion on climate change. So
Oh, happy.
Thank you so much, Clarence.
Thank you, Clarence.
Thank you, Clarence. It's fantastic.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, everybody. Have a good
Thank
night.
you.
Thanks, Mair and Nancy.
Everyone.
Thank you.
I'm going to my climate change meeting, actually. I just wanted to throw that out there with Clarence. Like, I'm headed to my activism meeting next. So thank you so much, everyone. This was wonderful.
Thank you for your
Nancy.
time.
Really appreciate it.